Hello and welcome to Saluting Dad's Army, a four-part series celebrating the world of Warmington-on-Sea and the enduring brilliance of a comedy show which first hit the air way back in 1968, but continues to win new fans all the time. Welcome, too, to this recreation of Captain Mannering's office, though perhaps I shouldn't say that, as Mr. Hodges, the air raid warden, would claim it's his office, and then the vicar would say, actually, it's my office, and we'd never hear the end of it. So, in this series, we aim to take you inside Dad's Army as never before, with specially recorded interviews and rare footage which together tell the full story behind British television comedy's finest half-hour. For 9 years and 80 episodes, the men of Dad's Army were in the front line of the ratings battle. And we'll learn how the show's success changed the lives of its stars.
Dad's Army restored my father's confidence in himself.
Good evening.
We'll discover the stories behind some of the show's most dramatic scenes.
John the Measurer was deliberately kept out of it because he was so impractical. We knew that he would not help at all. In fact, he'd probably make it worse.
And we'll uncover rarely seen sketches featuring the platoon on royal duties.
What is it, sir?
You're never going to accept this at the palace, you know.
There's a chance to see the cast and crew hard at it in rehearsal, and to hear from the 21st century comedy stars who grew up loving that weekly visit to Warmington-on-Sea.
Dad's Army was probably the most popular viewing in the Dennis household because it was one of those series that you could watch with your mum and dad and it wasn't embarrassing. That was the brilliant thing about it. It just seemed to work for everyone.
You know, sometimes, Wilson, I don't think you have the stomach for this job.
Well, there you have the advantage of me, sir.
To kick off, we're going back to the beginning, to hear about the inspiration for Dad's Army and how it reflected the reality of wartime life, to meet people directly involved in the birth of the show, and to find out how the heroes of Warmington-on-Sea not only defied Hitler and his Nazi hordes, but rapidly captured the hearts of the British public.
Don't panic! Don't panic!
Would you kindly step this way, please?
Oh, Wilson, bark it out, bark it out!
Right, now, would you kindly step this way, please?
They might use that torch where they tip your head back and pour gallons of water down you.
Oh, dear. I don't think I can stand to hear much of that.
We're doomed.
How about a nice bit of rabbit?
Rabbit, you'll be lucky. I haven't seen one for 6 weeks.
You have now.
You stupid boy.
However, Dad's Army's march to comedy greatness did encounter some pitfalls.
I shouldn't go too far that way, Mr. Mannering. There's a great big...
Right at the outset, presented with the idea of a comedy series about the wartime Home Guard, many senior managers here at the BBC asked,
Do you think it's wise?
The story behind Dad's Army really begins in May 1940, with the Nazi blitzkrieg of Western Europe. The government, led by new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, decided action was needed to defend Britain against a potential German invasion. Minister of War Anthony Eden was responsible for the government's plan.
Yes, Miss King.
It's Anthony Eden, sir.
In person?
On the wireless. They say it's very important.
Eden made an historic broadcast to the nation, including the Swallow Bank in Warmington-on-Sea.
We want large numbers of such men in Great Britain who are British subjects between the ages of 17 and 65. 17 and 65. The name of the new force will be the Local Defence Volunteer. This name describes its duties in 3 words.
The response to the radio appeal was dramatic.
Before he'd finished broadcasting, people were pouring down to the police stations. Within a week, they had 200,000 men. Within 3 weeks, about 1.4 million men.
In the Local Defence Volunteers, now renamed the Home Guard, the country has a new and powerful shield against invasion.
Those volunteers were brave men, actually, because they were the first line of defence in the case of an invasion. OK, an invasion never happened, but there was no way of knowing that it wouldn't. It seemed a real possibility.
That possibility seemed very real in an early episode of Dad's Army, the Battle of Godfrey's Cottage. Believing the Germans have landed, the Warmington platoon faces the ultimate sacrifice.
Now let's cross over to the key position. 3 determined men could hold an army there. Deny the enemy his axis of attack. If we can hold out for long enough there, it'll give our regular troops time to regroup for the counterattack. You see? Mind you, probably be the end of us, but we're ready for that, aren't we, men? Of course.
Among early volunteers like these was teenager Jimmy Perry. Jimmy's service in the Home Guard began here on Barnes Common in southwest London. Nearly 30 years later, he would draw on those experiences to write what became Dad's Army.
Yes, I was in the Home Guard when I was 16. And we all thought it was terribly funny then, because we were young boys, you see. And we were full of aggro, and we loved him.
He told us at the first rehearsal that he was Pike. He actually was the young boy in the platoon, wherever he was.
Look at this, Mr. Mannering.
From the off, Dad's Army reflected the reality of wartime life. This rare colour footage, shot in May 1940, shows local defence volunteers drilling in the Surrey town of Woking. And the scene isn't really very different from those early days in Warmington-on-Sea.
Squad, shut! Stand at ease.
The men of Dad's Army really were showing what life had been like for those first volunteers.
Sounds laughable, but they were equipped with some very old Lee Enfield rifles, and that was about the best they got at first. And some of them had pikes or spades or anything that you thought you could bash a Nazi with.
What's that supposed to be, boy?
Well, you said if you had nothing else, we'd tie a carving knife to a broom handle.
I didn't say keep the brush on the end of it, you stupid boy.
Well, he should have stayed.
I don't want any insubordination.
With the fact the Germans were going to invade, when you're 16, you're not thinking about that. Or you're going, and playing it and loving it and doing house clearing and charging about and really enjoying it. We didn't realise the gravity of the situation.
Right, Benetton and screaming at Mr. Hitler in person in your own time. Go!
That's the way for the first time on the parade.
With his wartime memories to draw on, in 1967, Jimmy Perry sat down to write a television comedy script, which he called The Fighting Tigers.
I had the idea just one day, and I sort of got the idea together, and I was working with David as an actor, and I mentioned it, and it went from there.
And so a partnership began between bit-part actor and Home Guard veteran Jimmy Perry and teenage air raid warden turned army officer turned BBC producer David Croft. They would work together for more than 25 years and across 4 hit television series. Though even on the very early episodes, it was clear that Jimmy and David were quite distinct characters.
I'd no idea who Jimmy Perry was, this lovely man, beautiful big blue eyes, beaming, laughing at everything.
David was very quiet, unassuming, but there was an authority there. There was great discipline in the rehearsal room.
At the suggestion of BBC head of comedy Michael Mills, The Fighting Tigers became Dad's Army. The challenge now was to turn Dad's Army from a script to a show, and that meant convincing sceptical executives at BBC Television Centre.
There was the thought that perhaps we were taking the mickey out of England's finest hour, so they weren't all that keen, really.
Years later, Hugh Weldon, managing director of BBC Television when Dad's Army was proposed, remembered being certain the show would fail.
I belong to a very distinguished group indeed of very senior BBC programme executives whose distinction lay in this, that we knew for certain that a script called Dad's Army wouldn't work.
The controller of BBC One also had some misgivings.
The tiny doubt I had about Dad's Army was there's a fine line to be drawn between mocking them and having fun with them.
Well, kick the door in.
Oh, right, sir, right, sir. Right, sir. At the door! Kick!
Having been a soldier myself, and David Croft having been a soldier, he observed that very clearly. And David was a genius. He decided he knew exactly where the line was drawn between mocking them and having a bit of fun.
It looks a bit deep to me, Mr. Manring.
No, it's all right, Jones. We can cross here.
Do you think that's wide, sir?
Don't argue, Wilson. I tell you, I can see the bottom.
Oh, good.
Forward!
Are you all right, Mr. Manring, sir?
Coming up in part 2 of Saluting Dad's Army, ruffled feathers on the first day of filming.
And he said to me, Arthur, that'll have to change.
The last-minute changes to episode 1.
We've been timing it, and we find we're 4 minutes over.
And Dad's Army has its doubters.
And I know my wife looked at it and she thought, I don't know whether this is going to succeed.
Welcome back to this celebration of Dad's Army. Of course, one big reason why the series ran for 9 years and still has millions of loyal followers was the absolute genius of its casting. The lineup was just inspired, ranging from newcomer Ian Lavender as Private Pike to veteran actor and playwright Arnold Ridley as Private Godfrey, and John Laurie, a major stage and screen name, as Private Fraser.
He was a star. He'd done lots of films. He'd great Shakespearean actor. He was the only one my mother had heard of.
However, the rest of the platoon might have looked rather different.
Name?
My card.
Joe Walker, wholesale supplier. I suppose you won't be with us very long. You'll be called up any day, I should think.
Oh, no, Gov, no. I'm, what's his name? Reserved occupation.
How do you make that out?
Well, I'm an wholesale supplier, aren't I? I mean, I supply essential supplies.
Any previous military experience?
I've got a girlfriend in the ATS.
Londoner James Beck was cast as the likeable rogue Private Joe Walker. But Jimmy Perry had created the role with someone very specific in mind.
He wanted Jimmy Beck's part. He wrote Walker for himself.
You know, that whiskey you get every week don't fall off a lorry on its own accord. Has to be pushed.
But before Dad's Army headed to its Norfolk base to begin location filming in April 1968, Jimmy had been persuaded not to play Walker and to concentrate on writing the show. Though Jimmy did appear in the first series as music hall comedian Charlie Cheeseman.
And now, customers, a little number dedicated to all fire watchers entitled, I Can't Get Over a Girl Like You, so turn out the lights yourself. Thank you, Professor.
As Jupiter and Mars.
While in one of the most memorable scenes in all of Dad's Army, actor and comedian Jack Haig plays a pub landlord who has some very unexpected visitors.
What can I get?
Good afternoon, mine horse. 16 shandies, Mr. Ginger Beer.
But in 1967, the BBC wanted to contract Jack Haig as Lance Corporal Jones, a role which would eventually be taken and then immortalised by an actor already known for playing characters much older than himself. 48-year-old Clive Dunn.
Mr. Speaker, yes? Why don't we chop off their trouser buttons?
What?
If we chop off their trouser buttons and they try to run away, that will show something unusual. I haven't come to the exciting bit yet. Don't panic, don't panic! There's a Nazi paratrooper dangling from the clock tower of the town hall.
Yes.
He's dangling.
We know, we're just going.
I'll get my rifle and my bayonet, sir.
You don't need your bayonet.
Yes, I do. When he comes down, they don't like it up.
As with so much of Dad's Army, the character of Lance Corporal Jones drew directly on Jimmy Perry's own experiences in the Home Guard.
I remember being on Barnes Common with this old soldier who'd fought in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898.
I served in that campaign with some distinction, you know.
I said, what are we going to do if the Germans come? If the Germans come, son, you'll do as you're told.
And his boss at the BBC expected David Croft to do as he was told when casting the key role of Captain Mannering and hire the established character actor John Le Mesurier.
John Le Mesurier was wished on me, actually, by Michael Mills. Michael Mills was the head of comedy. He said, well, you know, I think he ought to play the officer. I pondered this problem, and I just could not see him. And so sooner or later, we got this magic idea of him playing the sergeant and Arthur Lowe playing the officer, and it worked like a dream.
Arthur Lowe was familiar to millions from his years as store manager Leonard Swindley in Coronation Street. Now David Croft had decided Arthur was officer material and that John Le Mesurier should play his sergeant.
There were people around who thought that John Le Mesurier should play the captain and Arthur Lowe the sergeant, but David stuck to his theme, and he, of course, was right. The casting was brilliant.
Now, the first thing to do is to appoint a properly appointed commander. A what, sir? Appoint a properly appointed commander. That's me. All right? All right.
As Captain George Mannering, Arthur Lowe would write himself into comedy history. He brought a gift for physical comedy.
Very well, remember.
Alongside impeccable delivery.
I don't want any fuss. I just want to be like an ordinary sergeant.
I'm sure that would suit us all, Wilson.
And brilliantly captured Mannering's middle-class resentment of the upper-class Sergeant Wilson, so memorably played by John Le Mesurier.
I should have known not to trust that smarmy Captain Stewart.
Well, you can't blame him, sir. I mean, he's got a job to do.
Oh, you'll stick up for him, won't you? Both went to public schools, didn't you?
No, I can't help feeling, sir, you've got a little bit of a chip on your shoulder about that.
There's no chip on my shoulder, Wilson. I'll tell you what there is on my shoulder, though. 3 pips, and don't you forget it.
Over the years, there would be suggestions that Arthur Lowe shared some characteristics with the self-important Captain Mannering. When location filming began on the first series here in Norfolk, there were already signs that Arthur was a little status-conscious.
On the very first day's filming, we came out of the hotel to get onto the coach, and Arthur was sitting alongside me. And suddenly, the extras came in, and as they walked past us, one of them said, Arthur, good morning. And they went carried on, and he said to me, Arthur, that'll have to change.
Jimmy Perry was famously upbeat, but not everyone felt the same way when shooting began.
The first day of filming, we were delayed because it was snowing. It was supposed to be summer. And David, about 11:30, he said, I think we'll go for a shot in about 10 minutes. Go and tell him. And it's a terrible swank pot. He had his Rolls Royce there. And they were all crammed in this Rolls Royce, and the windows were all steamed up. And I opened the door, and they're all sitting in there. And I said, I was full of enthusiasm. I said, right, fellas, 10 minutes. We're going for a take, the first take for Dad's Army. And Arthur said, we'll come when we're ready. And I closed the door, and I went back to David. I said, we've got a bright, miserable load of old sods here.
Within a few years of its first appearance, Dad's Army was drawing huge audiences and winning major awards. But in 1968, that success looked a distant prospect to some people, as set designer Paul Joel discovered when he took the first scripts home.
I was excited. And I know my wife looked at it and she thought, I don't know whether this is going to succeed.
While here in the BBC canteen, a young actor in the first series met plenty of sceptics among his fellow professionals.
They just sort of scoffed at us and said, oh, that'll never work.
I don't want any of that sort of talk here, Wilson.
8th of April, 1968. First day rehearsal. When it was read out loud by everybody, then the laughs came, because you could see how each line fitted the character.
Them fuzzy buzzes, they was the only one that could break the British square. Not like those Jerrys, they couldn't break the skin off a rice pudding. They don't like the cold steel, you see, sir. They don't like it up 'em, you see, sir. They don't like the...
Get him a chair,
Together, Jimmy Perry and David Croft would create 80 scripts for Dad's Army. But they made a miscalculation on the very first episode, as Gordon Peters, cast to play a fireman, discovered.
I got a call on the evening of the third day from David saying, look, I don't know how to say this, Gordon, but we've been timing it and we find we're 4 minutes over. And the only solution, we're going to take the whole chunk of your scene as the fireman.
This is the scene in question, involving elaborate comedy business with hoses and Lance Corporal Jones getting his head stuck in a ladder.
I was disappointed, of course I was. If I'd known then what a success it was going to be, I'd have been heartbroken.
As it was, a considerate David Croft softened the blow.
He was really so apologetic. He was a nice man, David. He said, I promise you faithfully, I will use you in later episodes.
Within weeks, David Croft was true to his word, and Gordon made the first of several appearances in Warmington-on-Sea.
Once more, oh, for heaven's sake.
So the script had been written and cut to the appropriate length, the show had been cast, the sets had been built. It was now time to put Dad's Army to the test. Coming up in part 3, the first episode reaches the studio and the audience isn't impressed.
I think we all thought we flopped.
How Dad's Army started a battle within the BBC.
And the title sequence seemed to me too brutal.
And I meet a veteran of the Home Guard, the real Dad's Army. Welcome back. In the 1970s, Dad's Army was a huge hit show, featuring elaborate scenes worthy of a feature film. But that success was some way off when the studio clock started running on episode 1, The Man and the Hour, on the 15th of April, 1968.
I think we were all nervous because it was the first one.
5, 4, 3.
On the very first programme of Dad's Army, I was a vision mixer. That's somebody who sits with the director and cuts from camera to camera.
I was a commissioned officer, Wilson, and I served in France during the whole of 1919.
Yes, but war ended in 1918, I thought, sir.
Well, somebody had to clear up the mess.
Oh, yes, of course.
The audiences in the studio always seemed to love the programme as it was recorded, although I don't believe the very first episode was a great success.
Right, who's in charge here?
I am. Why?
Right, we'll get this all cleared out at once.
Bill Pertwee got a much bigger reception doing the warm-up than we did doing the actual show.
So get this lot out, so I can carry on with my lecture.
Are you asking the army to retreat?
Why not? You've had plenty of practice lately.
I think we all thought we'd flopped.
As if that weren't enough, the controller of BBC One wasn't impressed by the idea for the Dad's Army title sequence, strongly advocated by head of comedy Michael Mills.
It was a title sequence that depicted refugees fleeing down the roads in France, German planes coming over to strafe them, and that became a big argument with Michael Mills, because Michael was determined to have the original title sequence, and I was just as determined that the original title sequence was not on.
The dispute over seeing wartime events like this at the start of a comedy series led to the exchange of some forthright memos at the BBC, but the argument was only going to have one winner.
Even now, all those years later, I still feel it was right to have a title sequence that depicted comedy.
Britain was finally introduced to Warmington-on-Sea when Dad's Army and a title sequence which would soon become very familiar made it to the air at 8:20 p.m. on Wednesday the 31st of July, 1968. But this was months later than planned. Everything from football finals to dramatic world events had conspired to delay transmission at least twice.
To start a comedy series in July during the holiday period is not a good idea. But there it was. By that time, we were committed. There was a hole in the schedule. It had to go, which was the important thing to do.
Now then, you've answered your country's call today. We're all here to defend our homes and our loved ones. And I know that you will not shirk that duty. We've no guns. We're naked. But we have one invaluable weapon in our army: ingenuity and improvisation.
That's two.
So the following morning, the reviews were in, and they were kind of mixed. The Daily Mail wrote, "It isn't situation comedy or character comedy. It's only gag comedy. The quickest to write and the quickest wearing on the ear." The Daily Telegraph commented, "Often funny, but at other times the humour was laboured. But the reviewer in the Daily Express was spookily accurate when he predicted, "My instinct tells me that the BBC is about to come up with a classic comedy series." There had definitely been some anxiety at the BBC about a comedy series set when Britain was in peril. But soon, viewers were writing in to say how much they enjoyed the way Dad's Army depicted the war years. One lady claimed that butchers like Mr. Jones needed to be made of steel to withstand the flattery of their female customers.
Have I got enough for a joint?
Well, Mrs. Fox, of course. You have to do anything for £1/2 of, skirt or kidneys or a sausage.
Well, I suppose being a butcher, your business life is rather difficult at the moment, isn't it?
Oh, it is, sir. Everyone wants a bit under the counter.
Yes, I'm sure they do.
If I could tell you some of the things that have been offered to me for a bit on the side, how to make your hair stand on end.
Another viewer remembered that her husband had been on a Home Guard exercise to capture a farm. His platoon couldn't work out why no one was defending it until they realised the farm they were meant to be attacking was actually 5 miles away. Just the kind of mix-up that would become familiar in Wilmington-on-Sea.
On the phone to HQ quarters. Captain Mandarin in position 641937, I said. That's the target, he said. I've given him the wrong number. I forget my own name, Nick.
641937 is definitely where Captain Mandarin went.
Are you sure?
Absolutely. I never forget a number. They wanted me to go to the accounts department once, but I didn't fancy it.
But if that's the target for the £25, it'll all get blown up.
Oh, dear.
Well, don't panic. Don't panic. I'll tell her to stop the firing on the phone. Only don't panic. Don't panic!
But what did veterans of the real Home Guard make of Dad's Army? In March 1969, the BBC's talkback programme found out.
The characters in this are very, very true. And the fun that there's had and the things that happened are right to the point.
To hear at first hand about life in the Home Guard and its portrayal in Dad's Army, I've come to Norfolk to meet one of our very few surviving Home Guard veterans, Mr. Peter Blackburn. Peter, it's a real privilege to meet you, an actual member of the Home Guard. When you watch Dad's Army, do you recognise the Home Guard as you knew it?
In some respects, yes. It did have its moments. We had to do a lot of marching, battle drill and such like. So we did have a lot of that to do.
You're working on your parents' farm.
Yes.
That was a reserved occupation. You absolutely weren't, you couldn't be spared, so you weren't allowed to join the armed forces.
Yes, that's correct.
Why did you join the Home Guard? What was it that led to that?
Well, basically, I loved shooting. Other chaps, they went in for the ARP or other things. I prefer the Home Guard. I want to shoot.
Yeah. So what was your history in the Home Guard? How old were you when you joined up?
I was 17 years. 17 years, 2 days.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. So you had to be 17 to join up?
Yes.
You didn't hang about,
That's right,
did you?
yes.
You were the Pike of your outfit.
Sort of, yeah.
Peter enjoyed the Home Guard's drills and shooting practice, but the reality of war was never far away.
Because we did have a lecture.
Yeah.
And we said, no, boys, Germans are coming. We know that, they're coming. You're short of ammunition, and we don't want any Germans to hold us prisoners. And so when you take any captive, use your bayonet.
Use your bayonet?
No, I could not have done that.
No.
I couldn't have stuck a bayonet into a rabbit, let alone into somebody.
God, it's pretty gruesome, isn't
So
it?
we were told, no prisoners.
So given the Home Guard confronted matters of life and death, was the BBC right to worry about how its veterans would react to Dad's Army?
There was that concern. The BBC were very much wondering how people would take it.
Fair enough.
But as we all know, it went perfectly.
So when you watch Dad's Army now, do you like it?
Yes, very much so.
Mr. Mannering, please may I look after the hunting gun, please?
Oh, very well.
Thank you. They also call it the Chicago piano.
What did you say?
The Chicago piano.
Stupid boy.
Across 80 episodes of Dad's Army, Jimmy Perry and David Croft's scripts regularly found inspiration for comedy in actual events of the war years.
There's an episode of Dad's Army where they defeat an opposing Home Guard unit by firing onions out of what looks like a very crude gun. And in fact, that gun really did exist. It was called the Smith gun. So that's bang on there.
Coming up in part 4, the original vision for Mrs. Mannering. Memories of the stars from those early episodes.
No, no, my dear boy, the pleasure's all mine.
And forthright opinions about the scripts.
Oh, I wouldn't want that rubbish in my room.
Welcome back to Saluting Dad's Army, and the stories behind the birth of this classic show told by the people who saw it all happen, from the rehearsal room to the studio.
John Le Mesurier was a particularly interesting person for me to observe. Watching him in the rehearsal room, he was totally engrossed in the Times crossword throughout the week. But as soon as his cue came, he was there, spot on.
Meanwhile, Arthur Lowe made a favourable impression on Richard Kitteridge, a young actor hired as one of the platoon's back row boys, ahead of the second series.
Arthur Lowe was a very dedicated actor. He really got into the part. I mean, didn't matter how many times you did it in rehearsals, it was funny every time you said something.
However, even on those early shows, it was clear Arthur Lowe and John Le Mesurier had different approaches to their work.
John Le Mesurier had one of those eidetic memories that he could just look at a page and he'd sort of memorised it.
And word perfect, which was very impressive, because he didn't look as if he knew what was going on at all.
But unfortunately, Arthur Lowe was not very good on script, and that was always a little bone of contention in the studio.
Hey, where do you think you're going? It's only 5:50.
Playing bank employee Janet King, relative newcomer Caroline Dowdswell could observe Arthur Lowe's working methods at first hand.
King, draw those lines on your way out, will you, please?
He always carried the script with him in rehearsal, which I found very comforting. And it was only years later I found out he never took the script home. And they were always terrified in the box if he'd come out with the right lines.
I intend to ignore what has just happened, and I shall expect a full turnout on Saturday.
And quite a lot of I think, the character of Mannering came from the fact that he did forget his lines, and he then managed to get through it with kind of ums and ahs.
Well, be that as it may, I would have welcomed a sample of cooperation from you as my second in command.
So therefore, that was part of the excitement of doing those early episodes.
That sense of excitement was plain to a young actor guesting in the first series as a captured German pilot.
The audience reaction was fantastic. I mean, particularly in the church hall scene where we were captured and brought in, and Arthur Lowe was interrogating us. He got his script in a terrible muddle. And the audience loved it. I mean, they just loved to see all these little mistakes.
Arthur Lowe's reluctance to spend time learning his lines gave rise to stories that he didn't have a high opinion of the Dad's Army scripts. But this idea is dismissed by his son, Stephen Lowe.
Arthur did so much work, other work as well as Dad's Army, in parallel to recording Dad's Army, that sometimes he hadn't done his homework and he hadn't really learnt his lines.
Ah. I'm just wondering who'd be the first to spot that.
So one day David Croft, in exasperation, said, "Arthur, you couldn't possibly take the script home and learn your lines, could you?" And my father said this famous thing that's become famous now, you know, "Oh, I wouldn't want that rubbish in my home." And of course he didn't think it was rubbish. He held David Croft and Jimmy Perry in the highest regard. He thought they were brilliant writers.
When I was first informed that I was no longer to be your commanding officer, I must admit that my first reaction was to go away quietly. And then I thought, no, the defense of this town must come first. This country needs every able-bodied man it can get. And I was very proud to lead you as Captain Mannering. I shall be equally proud to march in your ranks as Private Mannering. That's all.
Arnold Ridley, I think David had to sort of wake up occasionally because he'd be sitting in the corner doing his crossword and sitting on a little stool that he carried around with him all the time.
While we're rushing here and there and running the flag up the pole, old Godfrey will still be trying to climb out of the van.
Come. That's a bit of an exaggeration, isn't it?
No, it's no exaggeration. It's plain for all to see. The man's decrepit. No offence.
John Laurie, I remember him chanting in makeup. He'd come in and everyone was fussing over Arnold or John Le Mesurier, and nobody was taking any notice of him, and he'd stomp off again.
John Laurie entertained the nation as James Fraser, the mournful undertaker, based here in the High Street.
Dear Mrs. Pickering, I hope you found the funeral arrangements for your late husband entirely satisfactory. May I say how sorry I was that the hearse ran out of petrol just outside the city. I'm sure your dear departed husband would have been proud of the way you helped to push him to his final rest.
Mr. Fraser seems ideally suited to his chosen profession, but it seems he changed his career late in life. Because when the first volunteers turn up here at St Aldham's Church Hall in episode 1, Fraser's in a completely different line of work.
Name, James Fraser.
Occupation?
I keep a philatelist's shop.
How do you spell that?
S-H-O-P.
Fraser's change of profession was just one way Dad's Army developed from its very early days. Take the residents of 23 Lime Crescent, Mr. and Mrs. Mannering. Elizabeth Mannering is the unseen presence who looms over her husband day and night.
You wake, Elizabeth.
But Jimmy Perry's original drafts of what became Dad's Army do feature Mrs. Mannering in vision. She's described as a thin, shivery lady about 40 and calls her husband dear. So Dad's Army evolved before and after it reached the screen. But at least one element remained utterly consistent. Captain Mannering's uncompromising hostility to the Nazi hordes poised across the channel.
Now, there are 2 things to look at here, but I want you to take particular notice of the eyes. You see the eyes? Mean, shifty, set too close together. Typically Nazi. Now, the thing to look for here is this red, nasty bull neck with the bulging out over the collar. That's also typically Nazi.
Mr. Mannering, aren't there any nice-looking Germans?
No.
The platoon chased a German pilot across the countryside for miles, only to discover he'd been chasing them.
Why do you keep running away? I have been trying to give myself up.
9, 8.
In the face on the poster, they somehow end up inside a camp for German prisoners of war. They also did their best to rescue a German parachutist hanging from the town hall clock. And, of course, there was an unforgettable confrontation with a captured U-boat commander.
And that's 4 with vinegar, 3 with salt, and 2 without salt or vinegar.
What are you doing?
I'm taking the order.
And I don't want any nasty, soggy chips. I want mine crisp and light brown.
Crisp and
Never mind that.
Captain Mannering seemed to think that his showdown with Captain Muller was his first crack at the Nazis.
Face to face with the enemy at last, eh?
He'd obviously forgotten that encounter with the enemy in the very first series.
Sir, permission to speak, sir. Yes, sir. We've captured a couple of Jerry parachuters. You what? Yes, sir. Just showed them the cold steel. They come quiet as mouses. They don't like it up 'em, you know, sir. They don't.
In the script, the regular cast kept their guns trained on their prisoners. But behind the scenes, the star's generosity made a lasting impression on a young actor playing one of the first Germans seen in Dad's Army.
We were stuck behind for this little scene where we German pilots were captured by Clive Dunn. We were left on our own, the three of us, and so I said to Clive Dunn, look, I've had no experience of television comedy. Can you tell us what to do? And he was really, really kind, so that was special for me.
After the show and a visit to the bar, it was time to say goodbye to the stars, including the oh-so-urbane John Le Mesurier.
And I said, thank you very much, sir. It's been a real pleasure to meet you and work with you for this week. He said, no, my dear boy, the pleasure's all mine. I don't know whether he's sending me up, but he was a real gentleman.
Hello.
Yeah, Wilson. How many times do I have to tell you not to say hello on the telephone? Announce yourself, officially. This is HQ, number 1 Company, B Platoon, Warmington-on-Sea, Home Guard. And you are Platoon Sergeant Wilson.
Yes, right. This is HQ, number 1 Platoon, B Company, Warmington-on-Sea, Home Guard, and this is Platoon Sergeant Wilson speaking, yes. Oh, hello.
Viewers just lapped up Dad's Army. The average audience for Series 1 in 1968 was just over 8 million viewers. When Series 2 hit the air just months later, that figure rose to 12 million.
Once it had got going, I mean, the genius of David Croft and Jimmy Perry and the cast made this such a surefire hit that it was vital to the schedule of BBC One.
All right, I wouldn't say I was all that important. Did you, Wilson?
No, I don't think so.
I cannot think of a comedy series that was so certain to be renewed as Dad's Army.
So, after a slightly uncertain start, Dad's Army became a runaway success. Literally.
Mr. Mannering! Stop, Mr. Mannering! Stop! All your money's falling out!
I've got to attract his attention.
Next time on Saluting Dad's Army, the stories behind the heyday of this classic series.
I think we ended up in a ditch.
And if you liked that, the next brand new and exclusive episode is on Tuesday night at 8 o'clock here on Gold. Up next tonight, Rodney down in the dumps. It's only Fools and Horses.